Joust. A game that pits you against waves of enemies in an arena while riding a flying ostrich. If that doesn't scream video game magic, I don't know what does. Whether you're familiar with Joust from its arcade glory days or you're stumbling upon the NES version for the first time, this game is bound to leave an impression. But is it worth revisiting in today's sea of retro gaming options? Stick around, because we're diving headfirst into this 8-bit adaptation to see if Joust for the NES soars to great heights, or crash lands in a fiery heap. Before we dissect the game, let's take a trip back in time. Joust was originally released as an arcade game in 1982 by Williams Electronics and designed by John Newcomer. It was a pioneer in the gaming world, blending fast-paced platforming action with cooperative and competitive multiplayer elements. Players were captivated by the quirky premise, controlling a knight riding a flying ostrich, tasked with defeating enemy riders atop buzzards. It stood out in arcades for its unique gameplay and distinctive art style. Fast forward to 1988, and the game made its way to the NES, part of a trend of classic arcade ports hitting home consoles. But, as with many arcade to NES adaptations, the big question was whether the magic of the original could be captured within the limitations of an 8-bit system. Let's start with the positives. At its core, Joust on the NES retains the charm and quirky premise of the arcade version. The mechanics are simple yet addictively challenging. Flap your ostrich to maintain height, collide with enemies at a higher elevation to defeat them, and avoid the dreaded lava pit at the bottom of the screen. The controls are straightforward, just a D-pad for movement and a button to flap your wings. The gameplay loop is easy to grasp but deceptively difficult to master, which is part of what made the original so engaging. The NES version also does a decent job of replicating the visuals and sound of the arcade. While it's not as polished as the original, the pixelated sprites of the knights and their mounts are charmingly detailed for the system. The sound effects, while repetitive, capture the chaotic energy of the arena. The frenetic pace of the action can really draw you in, especially during the later waves when enemies start swarming and platforms begin disappearing. But let's not sugarcoat it, this port has its flaws. One of the biggest issues is the controls. While the mechanics are simple, the responsiveness feels a bit off compared to the arcade version. Flying your ostrich can be a bit clunky, and it's not uncommon to find yourself inadvertently plunging into the lava due to poorly timed flaps. The collision detection also feels inconsistent at times, which can lead to frustrating moments when you swear you had the higher ground, only to lose a life anyway. Then there's the difficulty. Joust has always been a challenging game, but the NES version cranks up the frustration factor. The enemies, particularly the more aggressive ones in later waves, are relentless. And once you add in the occasionally uncooperative controls, it's easy to find yourself stuck in a loop of trial and error. The game does have infinite continues, which is a saving grace, but even that doesn't entirely offset the frustration of repeatedly losing to the same mistakes. Another notable downside is the lack of multiplayer options. One of the arcade's standout features was its 2-player mode, which allowed for both cooperative and competitive play. On the NES, this experience feels diminished with the absence of simultaneous multiplayer. It's a shame, really, because Joust's chaotic nature shines brightest when you're battling alongside or against a friend. So, where does that leave us? Joust for the NES is a mixed bag. On one hand, it's a nostalgic trip back to one of the most unique arcade games of the 80s. The core gameplay, while flawed, still manages to be engaging in bursts. But on the other hand, the clunky controls, steep difficulty curve, and stripped-down features make it hard to recommend as anything more than a curiosity for hardcore fans of the original. If you're a retro gaming enthusiast who thrives on a challenge and appreciates the history of gaming, you might find some enjoyment here. But if you're looking for a smooth, polished experience, this one might leave you more frustrated than entertained. And that wraps up our review of Joust for the NES. If you enjoyed this dive into retro gaming, be sure to give this video a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel for more reviews just like this. Let me know in the comments if you've played Joust and whether you prefer the arcade or console version. And if there's another classic you'd like me to review, drop your suggestions down below. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.